We reached a new month, so now it's time to rank all 7 July movies that I saw, from the worst to the best. Easily coming in at last place is the live-action Moana remake. This movie is terrible. Now, if this were the first time the story had been told, I honestly think I'd be saying that it's a fun adventure with memorable songs, colorful visuals, and likable characters. In other words, I'd be describing the original Moana. But because this is a scene-for-scene remake, I couldn't help comparing every single moment to the animated version, and every single time the original came out on top. Every emotional beat, every joke, every musical number, and every dramatic scene. There may be like 1 or 2 new jokes or lines sprinkled throughout the movie, but they honestly feel like leftovers from an early draft of the original script. Ideas that were probably replaced because someone came up with something better. Nothing here feels like a genuine improvement or a worthwhile reinterpretation. The songs are another disappointment. They don't even feel like fresh performances. They feel like cover versions, except they're not really covers, because aside from Moana's songs, many of them are sung by the same actors who performed them in the animated film, and somehow had even less energy this time around. The performances reminded me a lot of James Earl Jones returning as Mufasa in that live-action Lion King. The voice is recognizable, but the spark just isn't there anymore. This is one of the biggest problems with Disney's remake strategy. Instead of creating something that stands on its own, they keep recreating movies that already worked and worked almost perfectly the first time. As a result, you're constantly reminded that a better version already exists. I saw in the credits that Disney thanked Hawaii for tax benefits, and that explains why they made this and the soulless Lilo and Stitch remake last year. But if you're getting tax benefits anyway, why not just make an original movie set in Hawaii? Heck, I'd even take another Pirates of the Caribbean movie over this. I do want to give credit where it's due, though. The actress playing Moana does a perfectly respectable job. She's charming, capable, and clearly has talent. I genuinely hope this ends up being her big break, because I'd love to see her in an original project where she can really show what she can do, instead of spending an entire movie recreating someone else's performance. She deserves material that lets her create a character instead of simply imitating one. The film was directed by the director of Hamilton, and strangely enough, that's exactly what this adaptation feels like. It doesn't feel like a cinematic reimagining of Moana. It feels like a Broadway production of Moana that somehow received a blockbuster budget. The staging, performances, and overall presentation never escape the feeling that I'm watching another version of something I've already seen better. It feels less like a creative passion project, and more like another entry in Disney's growing assembly line of live-action remakes. One designed to capitalize on an already beloved property rather than justify its own existence. And that's really the biggest issue. The movie doesn't answer the question, why remake Moana? It only makes me ask it over and over again. It's so similar to the original that I honestly can't recommend it to anybody. If you're somehow determined to spend 2 hours watching Moana, just watch the animated version. It's funnier, more emotional, more energetic, and simply a better movie. I feel like this movie was made, other than the previously mentioned tax benefits, because the Black Adam movie did not do as well as The Rock was hoping, and he made this to pay off debts. He is one of the executive producers, after all. This was made just to inflate The Rock's ego and get a tax break for Disney. I'd go so far as to say this isn't even worth pirating. If you're just going to put in the effort to find a copy, spend that effort watching the original instead. At least then you'll be watching a superior version. This is the movie that puts the why in Disney. It's one of the most unnecessary remakes the studio has ever produced, and a very strong contender for the worst movie of the year. Number 6, Minions and Monsters. I'm probably one of the only people over the age of 6 who unironically enjoys most of the Despicable Me and Minions movies. I know these movies are not high art, I know they're silly, they're loud, and they're designed purely to sell toys, but for the most part I have a good time with them. I like the Despicable Me movies, and I think the first Minions is fun, and even when the movies are dumb, they're usually dumb in a charming way. So when I say this is definitely the weakest of the franchise, you better know what I'm talking about. This movie is not awful, it's not painful, it's not a cinematic disaster, but it is absolutely the one that made me sit there and ask, who on earth was this made for? Because the biggest problem with this movie is not that it's unwatchable, the biggest problem is that it feels like it was made for an audience that does not exist. The Despicable Me and Minions movies have always been, at their core, spoofs and homages to spy movies, supervillain stories, and heist films. That's part of why they work. Gru is essentially a cartoon James Bond villain who becomes a dad. Scarlet Overkill is this big theatrical comic book style supervillain. The Anti-Villain League stuff feels like a kid-friendly parody of spy franchises. Even when the movies are silly, they still feel like they belong to the same general ballpark. This one, though, suddenly decides it wants to be a 1920s Hollywood satire, mixed with references to old classic cinema, and I just do not understand that decision at all. The movie is set in 1920s Hollywood, and it keeps throwing in references to films and film culture from a completely different era. One of the main characters is a parody of Gort from The Day the Earth Stood Still, which makes no sense on two levels. First of all, if the movie is set in the 20s, why is there a character parodying a robot from a movie that didn't come out until 1951? Like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. And second, who is even supposed to get that joke? Kids obviously are not going to understand references to old Hollywood and black and white sci-fi movies from almost a century ago. Most parents probably aren't going to get those references either, unless they're classic film buffs or their parents raised them on really old movies. So the whole time I was watching this, I kept asking, what is the target demographic here? Because it's not like the movie is making these references in a way that becomes funny even if you don't understand them. Sometimes that could work. You can reference something obscure, but the joke still lands because the setup itself is funny. Here, a lot of it just feels random. It feels like the movie is elbowing the nerves going, hey, remember Casablanca? And I'm sitting there like, yeah, I know what Casablanca is, but why are you referencing it in the Minions movies? And that pretty much sums up the whole film. It doesn't feel like it has a clear identity. It just feels like two completely different movie ideas smashed together. On one side, you've got the Minions doing their shtick, and on the other side, we've got a weird old Hollywood parody full of references that most of the audience won't even get. And instead of blending together in this clever way, those two halves mostly just sit next to each other awkwardly and sort of butt against each other. Now, to be fair, the Minions themselves are still the Minions. If your kids like them, they'll probably still have a decent time. The slapstick is still there. There's a lot of the Three Stooges-style chaos, physical comedy, things exploding, characters getting hit in the face, and all the usual nonsense that kids tend to laugh at. There are a few moments where I chuckled. There are some decent background gags. There are a couple of self-aware jokes about how absurdly profitable the Minions are, which is probably the best joke in the movie, because at least that feels honest. Like, yes, thank you, movie, I'm glad we're all acknowledging these creatures are basically Universal's biggest cash cow. But outside of that, the story is incredibly thin. And I don't just mean simple, because these are Minions movies. I mean thin, as in there's barely enough material here to justify the runtime. The A story is basically just rehashing the first Minions movie. The Minions need to find a boss, and we go through another round of them bouncing from one bad situation to another after a montage of accidentally killing or losing their previous bosses. It's familiar territory, but not in a fun, back-to-basics way. It feels more like the writers looked at the first Minions and said, well, that worked once, let's just do it again, but with old movie references this time. And then the B story is basically just, look at all these old movie references. That's it. That's the bit. I keep comparing it to Space Jam: A New Legacy, because that movie had the exact same kind of feeling, where the entire point seemed to be, hey audience, look how many recognizable things we own. The difference is that with Space Jam, Warner Brothers was pulling from a giant library of movies and characters that most audiences at least kind of know. It had Batman, Superman, The Matrix, Harry Potter, and Looney Tunes, and even though the movie was bad, people at least recognized the IP being dangled in front of them. This feels like Universal trying to do their own version of that, except they're pulling from a much weirder and much older bag of references. So instead of, hey, remember iconic movies you grew up with, it's more like, hey, remember that one movie your grandpa might have watched? And I'm sorry, but that's not exactly a strong hook for a Minions movie in 2026. And the weirdest part is that the movie doesn't even seem sure how seriously to take its own premise. There's one character who never really clarifies whether he's supposed to actually be a robot alien conqueror or if he's just some delusional weirdo in a cheap costume, and normally ambiguity can be funny if the movie's leading into the absurdity. Here it just feels underdeveloped, like they couldn't decide what the joke was supposed to be. Is he meant to be a real sci-fi threat? Is he meant to be an actor who's gone insane? Is he just a gimmick? The movie doesn't really commit one way or the other, and that becomes a recurring issue with the whole thing. It doesn't commit, it just throws stuff at the wall and hopes the Minions screaming will distract you from the fact that none of it adds up. Then we get to the villain introduced in the third act, voiced by Trey Parker, and yeah, his voice gets old really fast. He's doing the same South Park voice he does for everything, and in a Minions movie, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's maybe for the first minute or two, because you recognize the voice and think, oh hey, that's Trey Parker, and then after that, you realize you have to listen to his South Park voice for the rest of the movie, and it becomes incredibly grating. It's one of those performances where the voice is doing so much work to be quirky and eccentric that it becomes exhausting. And when the villain is introduced that late, and isn't especially interesting to begin with, that voice becomes even more noticeable because there's not much else there. He is not a memorable antagonist. He feels like a last-minute obstacle the script needed because it was running out of movie. And that's kind of the story of the whole film. It feels assembled rather than written. It feels like someone had a boardroom pitch that went, okay, people like movies, people like Minions, let's do Minions in old Hollywood. Throw in some classic film references, some slapstick, a random villain, one or two jokes for the adults, and call it a day. There's basically nothing here that connects emotionally or thematically to the rest of the franchise. Outside of a few jokes during the credits, there's nothing that ties into the other movies in any meaningful way. It just feels really detached, like a spin-off of a spin-off. Not every movie in the franchise needs to have some deep emotional arc about family and belonging, but even the sillier entries usually have some kind of hook. Despicable Me because Gru becoming a dad. The second one is Gru balancing family life with spy life. The third one is the twin brother dynamic and the whole 80s supervillain thing. And Minions at least had clear road trip structure with Scarlet Overkill as a fun villain. This one just exists. There's no message or heart at all. Again, it's not totally without entertainment value. Kids will probably laugh at the slapstick. There are a few clever sight gags. I got a couple of chuckles out of Sephora jokes. And I will admit, hearing the word bastard in a Minions movie was absolutely not on my 2026 bingo card. That was one of those moments where my brain had to take a second to process what I just heard. But those little moments aren't enough to save a movie that otherwise feels so empty and so bizarrely targeted. If you have kids who love the Minions, I'm sure they'll be entertained enough once it hits streaming. They'll laugh at the chaos, the noises, the physical comedy, and the fact that little yellow corn pops continue to exist. But as an actual movie, there's basically nothing here. No clever new angle, no strong story, no memorable villain, no emotional core, no real reason for this to exist outside of the fact that the Minions print money. And that's ultimately what this feels like, a cash grab. Not even a fun cash grab, just a very obvious one. If you were to open the dictionary and flip the word cash grab, you would see the poster for this movie. So while I didn't hate it, it wasn't miserable, and thought it was mildly amusing in certain spots, it's easily the weakest film in the whole franchise, and one of the clearest examples of a studio making something not because they had a great idea, but because they knew the brand alone would sell tickets. Just wait for streaming and let your kids watch it at home with their Minions fans. If you're expecting something clever, fresh, or remotely beloved the better entries in the franchise, lower those expectations immediately. It's certainly a movie. It certainly has a plot. It certainly has characters. It certainly exists. Number 5, Water Park Shark. If you've already watched Sharknado, you already know exactly what kind of movie you're getting here. And that's not surprising because this comes from the same director as Sharknado films. This is one of those movies that fully understands how ridiculous its premise is and never pretends to be anything else. The idea is exactly what the title promises. There's a shark attacking people at a water park. None of it makes any logical sense, but that's also part of the fun. One of the things I appreciate most is the movie never tries to convince you it's making high art. Unlike some bad shark movies that accidentally become funny because they're trying so hard to be serious, this feels like everyone involved understood what kind of movie they're making. A cheesy B-movie, and they leaned into it. And the biggest inspiration is clearly Jaws. In fact, the mayor is basically a parody of the mayor from Jaws. He's far more concerned about keeping the attraction open and making money than he is about the customer's safety. It's not subtle, but that's intentional. The entire character feels like a loving spoof of one of cinema's most famous shark movie villains. The dialogue is another highlight, but not for the reasons the writers intended. There are so many lines that are awkward and clunky, but every actor delivers them with complete sincerity. Nobody winks at the camera or breaks character. They say the most unbelievable dialogue as if they're performing Shakespeare, and somehow that makes it even funnier. The acting overall is very much what you expect from a low-budget creature feature. Some performances are stronger than others, but everyone commits to the material. That commitment actually helps sell the movie's goofy tone. If the actors had been trying to make jokes every few seconds, it probably wouldn't have worked nearly as well. And of course we have to talk about the sharks themselves. The visual effects, of course, are cheap. There isn't really another way to describe them. The CGI is obviously low budget, and there are plenty of moments where the shark doesn't feel like it belongs in the same shot as the actors, but that's kind of part of the charm. You're watching a movie called Water Park Shark. You're not going to get Jurassic Park-level visual effects. Instead, the movie embraces its B-movie roots. The effects become part of the entertainment, rather than something that ruins the experience. The kills are also pretty creative. Since the movie takes place inside a water park, it finds fun ways to use the different attractions instead of simply repeating the same attack over and over. Water slides, pools, and other attractions all become potential danger zones, which helps keep things entertaining throughout the movie. The pacing also deserves some credit. At around an hour and a half, the movie moves along fairly quickly enough that it rarely becomes boring. There's always another ridiculous situation around the corner, another over-the-top attack, or another unintentionally hilarious conversation to keep things moving. Is it a great movie? Heck no. The story is paper-thin, the dialogue is awkward, the characters aren't memorable, and the effects definitely won't fool anyone. But I also don't think that's what the movie's trying to be. This is the kind of film you watch with friends, grab your popcorn, and laugh together at all the wonderfully ridiculous moments. It's entertainment because it's so gloriously over the top, not because it's excellent. If you're someone who enjoys serious shark movies like Jaws, this probably isn't going to be your thing, but if you're into a fun movie that includes films like Sharknado or other intentionally cheesy creature features, you'll probably have a pretty good time here. It's silly, self-aware, and never overstays its welcome. At the end of the day, it isn't trying to reinvent the shark movie genre. It's simply trying to entertain you with an absurd premise, terrible dialogue, and plenty of over-the-top shark attacks. Sometimes that's all you need. Number 4, Hadestown. Now, even though I saw this in a movie theater, it's not technically a movie. What this actually is a filmed production of Hamilton that's available on Disney+. It's a professionally recorded version of a Broadway performance rather than a traditional movie adaptation. Because of that, it has to be judged somewhat differently from an actual movie. In the movie, the filmmakers could use elaborate sets, location shooting, CGI, and other visual effects to literally show us the underworld and the various supernatural elements of the story. In a stage production, much more is left to the audience's imagination. The sets and effects are there to suggest a location or idea rather than completely recreate it. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's simply a very different medium, and it took me a little while to adjust to what I was watching. You have to accept that you're essentially sitting in the audience of a Broadway theater, just with much better camera angles and close-ups than you would normally get from your seat. The main idea behind the film is certainly interesting. It combines two Greek myths, the relationship between Hades and Persephone, and the tragic story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and reimagines them to a world inspired by 1920s Depression-era New Orleans. Instead of presenting the underworld as a traditional dark cavern filled with flames and mythical monsters, it becomes a smoky industrial world filled with workers, machinery, jazz, and blues music. That combination gives production a very distinctive personality. Even when the plot itself is familiar, the presentation makes it different from most other adaptations of Greek mythology. It's a creative gimmick, and it's a gimmick that mostly works. The music is one of the strongest parts of the production. The jazz, folk, and blues-inspired soundtrack fits the setting extremely well, and there are several genuinely catchy songs. Some of the music is a fun, energetic rhythm, while other songs have a darker and more mournful quality that fits the tragic nature of the story. Because this is almost told entirely through music, the songs are also responsible for doing most of the storytelling. There isn't a lot of traditional spoken dialogue, so whether or not the production works for you will probably depend heavily on how much you enjoy the musical style. I thought the music was memorable enough to carry the production, although there were moments when I wished the story would slow down and give the characters more opportunities to simply interact with each other. The performances are great all around. Everyone fully commits to the unusual world and style of the production, and the cast members all have powerful voices. Even when the characters are not given a huge amount of development, the actors bring a lot of emotion and personality to their performances. Patrick Page is especially entertaining as Hades. His incredibly deep voice immediately makes the character feel intimidating and larger than life. At times he almost reminded me of Oogie Boogie from Nightmare Before Christmas, particularly when he's leaning into the more theatrical and villainous side of the character. However, Hades isn't presented as a completely one-dimensional villain. There are moments when he appears tormented, lonely, or insecure, especially in his relationship with Persephone. He wants control over everything around him, but underneath that control is a fear of losing what he has. Patrick Page manages to make Hades fun to watch, while still giving him a little more emotional complexity than I was expecting. The relationship between Hades and Persephone is probably the most interesting part of the story. They clearly still care about each other, but their marriage has deteriorated over time. Persephone resents being trapped in the underworld for so much of the year, while Hades has become increasingly controlling and obsessed with maintaining the world he's built. Their relationship acts as a darker parallel to Orpheus and Eurydice. They represent a younger and more hopeful kind of love, while Hades and Persephone show what can happen when love becomes damaged by mistrust, control, and resentment. That comparison gives the story more thematic depth, even though I still think the individual characters could have been further developed. That brings me to my biggest criticism, though admittedly it may be more of a nitpick. There just isn't a tremendous amount of character development. I understand the production is following the basic structure of the original myth, and Greek mythology does not always give its characters the same kind of detailed development that we expect from modern stories. However, there is a significant point between the first and second acts, when Orpheus travels to the underworld in order to rescue Eurydice, and we don't get to see much of that journey. I think showing more of that journey could have added a lot to the story. We could have seen Orpheus struggle with fear, doubt, exhaustion, or temptation as he descended into Hadestown. It could have made his determination to save Eurydice feel even more powerful, and helped us understand how the journey affected him. Instead, the story moves relatively quickly from one major event to another. We understand that Orpheus loves Eurydice and wants to save her, but I never felt as emotionally connected to their relationship as he probably should have. Considering their romance is supposed to be the emotional center of the tragedy, I wanted a little more time with them as people. The same is true of Eurydice's decision to go to Hadestown. Her reasoning makes sense within the story, especially because she is desperate, hungry, and searching for security. Still, the production could have spent more time developing her internal struggle. A few additional scenes or conversations might have made her choices feel even more tragic. That said, I don't have any particularly major criticisms. I had a pretty fun time watching this, and I can understand why the stage production has such a devoted fan base. The music is catchy, the performances are excellent, and the combination of Greek mythology with Depression-era jazz and industrial imagery gives the production a style of its own. However, I'm not convinced that seeing the filmed version in a movie theater is essential. Unless you're a die-hard theater fan who's always wanted to see a production of Hadestown and now finally has the opportunity, I don't think a theatrical presentation really justifies the extra expense. There wasn't anything about watching it on a movie screen that dramatically enhanced the experience for me. The production itself is obviously designed to be viewed in a live theater, where you are physically in the same room as the actors and can feel the energy of the audience around you. A movie theater screening of a recording exists in a strange middle ground. You aren't experiencing it live, but you also don't receive the expanded visuals or cinematic scope of an actual movie adaptation. I think I would have gotten almost exactly the same experience watching it at home on streaming. Because of that, my recommendation would be to wait until it becomes available to stream, unless you're already a major fan of the musical or simply love seeing theatrical productions on a big screen. The production also technically does not have a traditional movie age rating, but it is surprisingly clean. There's no strong language, graphic violence, or anything overly raunchy. There is some mature themes involving death, poverty, unhealthy relationships, and characters drinking, but nothing is presented especially graphic. I would personally describe it as a very light PG-13, and even that is mostly because of the darker themes rather than any specific objectionable content. Compared with many modern musicals, it's actually quite restrained. Overall, Hadestown is enjoyable, creative, and extremely well performed. It takes familiar Greek myths and gives them a unique musical identity through its mixture of jazz, blues, folk music, and depression imagery. At the same time, the unusual setting is also a large part of the appeal. Once you get beyond the concept of Greek mythology presented through the style of 1920s New Orleans jazz, the actual plot and characters are not especially deep. The story works more as a tragic fable rather than as a detailed character study. Still, the music and performances make it worth watching. If the idea of seeing Greek mythology reimagined as a smoky jazz musical sounds appealing to you, you'll probably have a good time. Just know the filmed version doesn't necessarily need to be seen in a movie theater, and the production style is ultimately more memorable than its character development. Number 3, Descendants Wicked Wonderland. Now, I did not like the movie that came before this, Descendants Rise of Red. I found most of it boring, and aside from the opening number introducing Red, almost none of the songs stuck with me. Thankfully, Wicked Wonderland is a significant improvement. The plot is much more interesting this time around. It's still flawed, but at least I was invested in what was happening. I especially like the idea of the ending The Rise of Red creating a new timeline. Because history has been altered, some characters who were previously villains are now heroes, while others who were once good have turned evil. That is a fun concept with a lot of potential, and it gives this movie a stronger hook than the previous one. The music is also catchier and more memorable, although most of the songs feel more like modern top 40 pop hits than songs in a Disney musical. There is one major exception, the villain number performed by the Mad Hatter's son. It is a genuine showstopper that feels like a classic Disney villain song. The performance is delightfully over the top, and you can tell the actor is having a great time playing such a cartoonishly evil character. Unfortunately, the rest of the soundtrack is too pop-heavy for me, and the songs are packed much too closely together. It feels as though somebody starts singing every 5 minutes. In the first 3 Descendants movies, there would often be around 15 minutes between musical numbers, giving the story and characters room to breathe. Here, the movie sometimes seems impatient to get to the next song. Some elements of the story also do not make much sense within the Disney universe. For example, one character is the son of Robin Hood. I know Robin Hood is traditionally depicted as a human and that the legend has been told for centuries, but this is specifically the Disney universe. Disney's Robin Hood is a fox, so why is his son suddenly human? You also meet the daughter of Captain Hook and the son of Dr. Facilier, and that raises another continuity question, because the second and third films already introduced Hook's son and Facilier's daughter, so why were these siblings never mentioned before? It is certainly possible they existed off-screen, but it still feels strange for the movie to introduce them without acknowledging the other characters. One of the best surprises, one of the main characters, is the descendant of someone from Encanto. I love seeing that movie brought into the larger Descendants universe. However, his character arc is essentially the same as his parents' arc in Encanto. Wasn't the entire point of that movie to stop passing unhealthy expectations and pressure down through generations? It feels odd to see the exact same problem happen again for the very next generation. I also have to give credit to Awkwafina. I have said many times I usually find her extremely annoying, but she genuinely surprised me here. As the daughter of the Cheshire Cat, she reigns in the usual Awkwafina persona and delivers a much more controlled voice performance. She still sounds like she's having fun being evil, but she never becomes unbearably over the top. I never expected to say this, but Awkwafina is actually pretty good in the movie. Not everything feels fresh, however. One of Wonderland's challenges involves a chess game with giant pieces, which already feels heavily inspired by the first Harry Potter. It then leads to a musical number featuring knight chess pieces breakdancing, which is almost exactly what happened with the knights in Descendants 3. The third act also repeats another idea from that movie. A certain character becomes the villain, and it feels like the filmmakers are recycling Audrey's storyline from the third film. The circumstances are different, but the overall direction is familiar enough that it loses some of the impact. Even with those problems, I thought Wicked Wonderland was much more entertaining than Rise of Red. The timeline concept is intriguing, the story held my attention, several songs are memorable, and the Mad Hatter's son gives this kind of gloriously theatrical villain the franchise needed. The ending essentially confirms that a 6th movie is coming, and surprisingly, I am now genuinely interested in seeing where the franchise goes next. I would love to meet the descendants of some overlooked Disney characters, maybe Yzma, Maui, or even Stitch and Angel. There are plenty of corners of the Disney universe for these movies to explore. It doesn't completely recapture what made the original trilogy work, but it is a definite step in the right direction. Our runner-up is Avatar: Aang the Last Airbender. This was absolute perfection. I honestly don't know what else I could have wanted from an Avatar movie. Aang the Last Airbender takes everything that people loved about the animated series, the characters, comedy, action, mythology, emotion, and incredibly creative bending, and successfully translates it into a movie. It doesn't feel like a cheap attempt to bring back a beloved franchise, and it doesn't feel like an extra long episode of the show stretched out to fill 90 minutes. This genuinely feels like the next major chapter in the story. The movie does provide enough backstory for people who may be unfamiliar with the original series. It explains the four nations, the different styles of bending, the Avatar cycle, and Aang's role as the person responsible for maintaining balance in the world. Essentially, this universe's version of the Messiah. Obviously, you're going to get much more out of the movie if you've already watched the show, but that should probably go without saying. This was clearly made primarily for existing fans, even though it does make an effort to welcome in newcomers. For longtime fans, there are so many character relationships, references, emotional moments that carry much more weight, because we know what these characters have already experienced together. We watch them grow from children who return to survive a 100 Years' War, into the heroes who eventually brought peace back to the world. Seeing them older, more experienced, and dealing with a completely different kind of conflict is incredibly satisfying. One of the best things about the movie is the characters still feel like themselves. Aang is still optimistic, compassionate, and playful, but he's also matured considerably. He isn't exactly the same child we knew during the series, because he's lived through more experiences, and now understands the enormous responsibility that comes with being the Avatar. At the same time, the movie doesn't make the mistake of turning him into a completely serious or humorless character. He still has that sense of wonder and that lighthearted personality that made him so lovable in the first place. The same is true of the other returning characters. They've clearly grown since the events of the show, but their personalities have not been rewritten. Their friendships feel natural, the jokes sound like things the characters would actually say, and their conflicts are based on how they changed over time, rather than being forced into the story simply to create drama. It truly feels like we're catching up with old friends, rather than watching new characters who really happen to share the same names. The movie also introduces some great new characters. Quan appears briefly, but he's easily responsible for one of the funniest scenes of the entire movie. He isn't in it for very long, but he takes full advantage of the screen time that he has. His comedic timing works perfectly with the type of humor that Avatar has always used. His appearance could have easily felt like a distracting celebrity cameo, but instead he fits naturally into the world and leaves a memorable impression. Dave Bautista also gives a great performance as a character who I wouldn't necessarily describe as a villain. He certainly does bad things, and his motivations are misguided, but you can't understand why he believes what he's doing is right. That makes him much more interesting than someone who simply wants to conquer the world or gain power for no reason. There's also a new group of antagonists called the Denied. The Denied believe that it is fundamentally unfair for benders to possess so much power, while ordinary people are born without any bending abilities. From their perspective, the entire world is controlled by people who are given extraordinary abilities through no effort on their own. Meanwhile, non-benders are expected to live alongside these people without having any similar way to protect themselves. That is such an interesting idea because there is at least some truth behind their complaints. Benders do have an enormous natural advantage, and throughout the original series, we saw how easily those abilities could be abused. The Fire Nation used bending to conquer most of the world. Powerful benders have served as soldiers, criminals, political leaders, and dictators. Even in times of peace, it makes sense that some non-benders would feel powerless and forgotten. Of course, the methods used by the Denied are wrong, but their frustration is understandable. That gives the conflict a lot more depth. The movie doesn't ask us to agree with them, but it does allow us to understand how they reach those conclusions. They aren't simply evil people who hate the Avatar. They believe the world's entire power structure is unfair, and that they're the only ones willing to change it. That is one of the movie's greatest strengths. It expands the mythology without contradicting what came before it. We learn more about how the world has changed, how people now view the Avatar, and what happens when Aang's idea of balance is challenged by people who don't believe the system was balanced in the first place. It gives Aang a problem that he cannot solve simply by defeating one powerful enemy. As the Avatar, Aang's responsibility is to protect balance. What exactly does balance mean when a large group of people believe the world has never treated them fairly? That forces him to think about his responsibilities differently. He still has to stop people who are hurting others, but he also has to listen to the reasons behind their anger. That is a much more mature conflict for an older Aang, and it shows that the franchise has grown alongside its characters and audience. The action is also every bit as great as it was in the show. The bending remains creative, fast-paced, and visually exciting. Each bending style feels distinct, with movements and strategies that reflect the element being used. The fights aren't just characters throwing different colored energy at each other. Aang uses airbending differently from how an earthbender fights, and waterbending requires a completely different rhythm of firebending. The movie also understands that bending battles work best when the environment becomes part of the fight. Characters use buildings, streets, water, rocks, and objects around them, rather than simply standing still to fire attacks back and forth. The action tells us something about each fighter's personality and experience. Aang's movements are agile and defensive, while other characters rely more heavily on strength, precision, or aggression. Most importantly, the action has emotional stakes. We care about the people involved, understand what they're fighting for, and know what could happen if they fail. The largest sequences are certainly impressive, but the movie never becomes so focused on spectacle that it forgets about its characters. The comedy is also fantastic. Avatar has always been able to move between serious drama and ridiculous humor without making either side feel out of place. This movie continues that tradition. There are some very emotional and intense scenes, but the story knows when to give the audience a chance to laugh. Humor comes naturally from the characters and the personalities. Another thing I really appreciate is that this feels like an actual movie. That may sound like a strange compliment, but a lot of television continuations can feel like several episodes awkwardly edited together. This has a clear beginning, middle, and end. The story steadily builds towards its climax, the action becomes larger as the conflict escalates, and the characters go through complete emotional arcs. At the same time, it doesn't waste time reintroducing every character, explaining every event from the original series, and trusts that the audience knows these people and wants to see where their lives have gone next. The filmmakers found a great balance, no pun intended, between honoring the past and telling a new story. The animation is gorgeous as well. The Avatar universe has always had some of the most expressive and imaginative animation on television, and giving the story a theatrical budget, even though it went to streaming, allows the world to feel even larger. The landscapes are beautiful, the cities feel alive, and the many effects look incredible without losing the style of the original series. There is a real sense of skill throughout the movie. Where the characters travel, you feel they are moving through an enormous world with different nations, cultures, and histories. The world doesn't exist only as a background for the action. It feels like a place that has continued changing since the end of the original show. Above everything else, this movie understands why people love Avatar. We love it because of the bending and the action, but we also love it because of the characters, humor, mythology, and themes. It can tell stories about war, trauma, prejudice, responsibility, and political inequality, while still giving us strange animals, funny character interactions, and spectacular battles. Aang the Last Airbender has everything I could have wanted. It has fantastic action, genuinely funny comedy, meaningful character development, great new additions to the mythology, and an antagonist whose motivations are understandable, even when his actions are wrong. The returning characters feel exactly like the people we remember, while still showing how much they've grown since the original series. New viewers should be able to understand the basic story, but longtime fans are obviously going to appreciate it the most. This is a celebration of everything that made the original show special, but it's also confident enough to introduce new ideas and move the world forward. If you're an Avatar fan, you are absolutely going to love this movie. I genuinely have no major criticisms. It delivered everything I hoped for and then some, and it gave me even more than I hoped. We get a trilogy. And in first place is Spider-Man Brand New Day. Destin Daniel Cretton was definitely the right choice to direct Spider-Man Brand New Day. He previously directed Shang-Chi, and you can absolutely see some of that same style here, especially with the action sequences. The fights feel fast, physical, and carefully choreographed. Every punch, swing, dodge, web attack feel like it has actual weight behind it. At the same time, the action never becomes so complicated that you lose track of what's happening. That is especially important because this is a very different kind of Spider-Man movie from the previous 3 MCU installments. Those movies continually became bigger and bigger. Homecoming involved advanced alien technology, Far From Home took Spider-Man across Europe and ended with a massive drone attack, and No Way Home broke up in the multiverse and brought in villains and Spider-Mans from several different universes. This movie wisely goes in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to make everything even bigger than the multiverse, Brand New Day brings Spider-Man back down to the streets of New York City. The threat is smaller and more personal. There's no giant portal opening above the city, no army invading Earth, and no collection of villains being pulled in from other realities. This is Spider-Man dealing with crime in his own neighborhood. That made the movie feel like classic Spider-Man again. For the first time in the MCU, Spider-Man is also given a threat that truly feels like his own. He's not cleaning up another mess created by Tony Stark. He's not fighting villains or personal grudges against completely different versions of Spider-Man. He's not being recruited to participate in somebody else's battle. This is Peter's city, Peter's enemy, and Peter's responsibility. The story feels extremely self-contained, and I mean that as a major compliment. It still takes place inside the larger MCU, and several recognizable characters appear throughout the movie, but you don't need the entire MCU standing behind Spider-Man to make a story feel important. The movie finally trusts Spider-Man enough to let him carry the story himself. It was also refreshing to see that Spider-Man is genuinely beloved in this version of New York. He's not constantly being treated as a menace or criminal or some dangerous vigilante who needs to be arrested. Obviously, Spider-Man being misunderstood has always been a major part of the character, especially whenever Triple J is involved, but we've already seen that storyline multiple times. Here, people recognize that Spider-Man has spent years protecting them. New Yorkers cheer for him and treat him like he's part of the city. He feels like a mysterious masked vigilante and more like a neighborhood hero is where the public's trust. The movie also takes full advantage of the 5-year gap between No Way Home and Brand New Day. Rather than picking up immediately after the previous movie, the filmmakers allow time to pass within the story. Peter's been operating as Spider-Man on his own for years, and he's clearly gone through several adventures that we never saw. What I really appreciate is that the movie does not stop for 5 minutes every time it references one of those adventures. We learn that Spider-Man has a history with Punisher, Scorpion, The Hand, and several other characters, but we're not shown a lengthy flashback explaining every single detail. Instead, the film trusts the audience to piece things together through context clues, jokes, and casual pieces of dialogue. You understand that Spider-Man has been protecting New York for years. During that time, he's made enemies, allies, and developed relationships with other heroes and vigilantes. It makes the universe feel much bigger because it creates the impression the adventures have been happening, even when we're not watching. It's like how comic books sometimes begin in the middle of a hero's ongoing life. You might not know the full history between two characters, but you understand enough from the way they speak to each other. Unfortunately, I do have a few criticisms. My biggest problem is I think real-life circumstances influence part of the script a little too much. I've said before I do not buy into the romance between Peter and MJ. I know Tom Holland and Zendaya have a real relationship, and I'm genuinely happy for them both. However, their real-life chemistry does not automatically translate to romantic chemistry between their characters. As Peter and MJ, I just do not buy it. At the end of No Way Home, she no longer remembered Peter. That ending was tragic, but also created an opportunity for the next movie to take Peter in a completely new direction. He could build a new life, meet new people, and potentially develop a relationship with another character. Instead, the film establishes that MJ has moved on and is now with another guy, while Peter spends most of the movie trying to figure out how to get her back. Like, dude, move on. I understand why Peter still cares about her. From his perspective, she was one of the most important people of his life. He remembers everything they went through together, even though she does not. That is emotionally painful, and the movie does explore that sadness fairly well. However, after a certain point, his attempts to win her back became to feel uncomfortable and obsessive rather than romantic. MJ has built another life. She does not remember their relationship, and she's currently involved with someone else. Peter needs to accept that, rather than spending the entire movie trying to create something that no longer exists for her. And it's not like Spider-Man has a shortage of possible love interests. This is Peter Parker. He's dated practically every woman in the Marvel Universe at least once. Give him a new romantic interest. Heck, Peter has more chemistry with Yelena during a 2-minute scene than he has with MJ throughout the entire movie. I'm not necessarily saying that those two need to become a couple, but their brief interaction had the energy. They bounce off each other naturally, their personalities clash in an entertaining way, and you immediately want to see more of them together. That scene made the ongoing Peter and MJ storyline feel a bit weaker by comparison. Now, before seeing the movie, I was also worried it might become overstuffed. We knew the Punisher, Hulk, and a few other characters be appearing. After seeing so many superhero movies struggling to balance some enormous casts, I was concerned that the film might once again become a supporting character inside its own movie. Thankfully, that is not what happens. The side characters used to enhance Spider-Man's story rather than overshadow it. Each character appears for a specific reason, contributes something important to the plot, then allows the focus to return to Peter. The movie does not feel like it's constantly pausing to advertise 5 future Disney Plus shows or set up the next 10 Marvel movies. The Punisher, in particular, fits naturally into the street-level environment. His methods create an interesting contrast with Spider-Man's morality. They're both trying to protect innocent people, but they have completely different ideas about what justice looks like and how far someone should go to stop a criminal. Hulk's role is also handled much better than I expected. He does not enter the movie simply so the trailer to show Spider-Man standing next to another famous Avenger. His involvement actually connects to the story's themes, and he never takes the focus of the movie away from Peter. That balance is one of the film's greatest accomplishments. It remembers that supporting characters are supposed to support the main character. This is also easily the darkest Spider-Man movie we've ever received, and I'm including the Raimi movies, Andrew Garfield movies, and the Spider-Verse films in that statement. There are themes involving torture, experimentation, manipulation, and the physical suffering the characters have endured. Some of the imagery is surprisingly dark for a Spider-Man movie. The villain's methods are genuinely cruel, and the film does not shy away from showing the emotional damage caused by those experiments. However, the movie never becomes completely miserable either. There is still enough humor, warmth, and classic Spider-Man personality to prevent the darker material from overwhelming everything else. Peter still cracks jokes during fights. He still has awkward interactions with ordinary people. New Yorkers still cheer for him while he swings through the city. That lightheartedness is important, because Spider-Man works best when his stories contain both tragedy and humor. Peter's life can be incredibly painful, but Spider-Man is still supposed to represent hope. He gets knocked down, but he makes jokes and keeps moving. And visually, the movie is fantastic. The way it's shot and the way the fights are choreographed often feel like watching a live-action version of the PlayStation Spider-Man games, and I mean that in the best way. Spider-Man moves with a combination of speed, agility, improv, and creativity. He doesn't simply punch people repeatedly. He uses walls, ceilings, fire escapes, passing cars, web lines, and almost anything else in his environment. The camera follows him as he swings between buildings, changes direction in midair, and launches himself into combat. Some superhero movies make their characters feel like actors being pulled around on wires in front of a green screen. Here, Spider-Man feels like he actually belongs inside New York City. The action has a sense of momentum, and several sequences look like they could have been taken directly from a playable mission in the games. I do have one other complaint involving the villain's powers. Without going too deeply into spoilers, Spider-Man appears to be the only major character who is somehow resistant to one of the villain's abilities, and the movie never provides a satisfying explanation as to why. There were several moments when I expected the story to reveal that Peter's spider sense, altered biology, or some earlier event to give it protection. Instead, it mostly seems to happen because Spider-Man needs to remain conscious long enough to defeat the villain. That is some pretty obvious plot armor. It doesn't ruin the movie, but it does create a noticeable gap in an otherwise carefully constructed story. Even 1 or 2 lines of dialogue could have explained it. Maybe a spider sends towards his nervous system. Maybe his enhanced metabolism processes the effect differently. Give us something. Despite those criticisms, Brand New Day is easily the best of the MCU Spider-Man movies. It finally makes Spider-Man feel like a main character again. It gives him a personal threat, brings him back down to the street-level roots of the source material, and allows him to stand on his own without relying on Tony Stark, the Avengers, or alternate universe heroes. The supporting character is used effectively without taking over the movie. The action was some of the best we've seen in any Spider-Man film. The darker material gives the story real weight, while the humor and heart prevent it from losing the classic Spider-Man spirit. I may not care for the continued focus on Peter and MJ's relationship, and the villain's powers create some unexplained plot armor, but those are relatively minor problems in an otherwise excellent movie. This is the Spider-Man movie I have been wanting from the MCU. It feels personal, self-contained, energetic, emotional, and unmistakably Spider-Man. And it comes in at number 1. It's going to share in the July movies that you saw this month, and I will see you next time.